I'd like to tell you about a free app that I've been using from Enverus Energy Link called Mineral IQ. Mineral IQ enables you to view monthly income, track earnings trends, and download pay stubs. It also provides in-depth valuation information you can use to make confident decisions when to sell or what to buy. It even tracks surrounding rig and permit activity and provides you with that data on a weekly basis. One Mineral IQ user said, "I had just inherited some income on a well, and Mineral IQ's appraisal feature gave me the confidence to hold on to my interest instead of selling it at the wrong price." If you aren't already signed up, be sure to visit www.mineraliq.com today to get started. Again, that's Mineral IQ to get started for free today. And I would encourage everyone to check it out. I've been really impressed with the Mineral IQ platform. And since it's free, what are you waiting for?
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm here to help you make the most of your mineral rights and royalties. And I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams. Justin, welcome to June in Portland, Oregon. Denver, Colorado, where it's been raining nonstop. It almost feels like for the past month or so.
I know it is. It's the greenest season I've ever seen here. But hey, I'll take it over snow. You just hope it's not hail here.
Yeah, every day we have to kind of monitor the thunderstorms and see, do we need to pull the flowers in? Are they going to get hailed on? But to your point, it's good to see the green. Our yard is certainly loving this moisture. I think that it's throwing a wrench in some outdoor activities, but I guess that's the price you pay for living in the Rockies where the weather can always be changing. And there's a saying that if you don't like the weather, just wait an hour or so. Anyway, we're going to talk today about something related to climate and related to weather, and that is around how companies are reducing emissions by generating electricity from stranded natural gas on well sites. Now, we talked about this in previous episodes where companies are using remote data centers and natural gas generators to mine Bitcoin. And that is just one application that companies are applying to taking advantage of this low-cost energy that otherwise would be flared, which, Justin, turns out is actually not that great for the environment.
Absolutely, Matt. And they're putting it to good use. And, this market's really developing. And like you mentioned, not only Bitcoin, but there's other cloud computing options that are coming out. We're seeing it be a trade-off for companies where they can reduce their emissions. And there's some big claims from people out there. I'm sure reality is somewhere between what's being claimed and what's being done. But it's great to see this excess natural gas being used for a good purpose.
Yeah, I think that is really important to think about. We have finite natural resources. We might as well use it if it's otherwise going to be burned, if there's no pipeline to hook it up to. And that's the only option for a company to produce the oil. Most states are cracking down on flaring, routine flaring at least. So there can be the need to flare if there's an upset condition, if there's an emergency. In order to prevent a bigger safety issue from occurring, they might need to temporarily flare natural gas. But most of the time, companies are looking at installing pipeline infrastructure, trying to sell the gas and take advantage of the value that's associated with it. But in some cases, it's just too far away from the market to hook up via pipeline, but there is a way to transport oil. And so that has been the case historically in the Williston Basin, the Bakken, parts of West Texas as well, or an area that has had historically high levels of flaring for the associated natural gas with these large oil wells. So that is something that is definitely on the rise as companies look to decrease their carbon footprint and as states look to crack down on routine flaring. And like we talked about, there's 2 episodes to key in. If this is the first time you're hearing about this, we covered it in a little more detail on what Bitcoin is and how they mine it with natural gas on episode 140. And then we spoke with Jacinda Brown on episode 141 about how companies like hers were using Bitcoin mining to monetize that stranded natural gas. And so what we're going to talk about today are really actionable tips for organizing and structuring your oil and gas lease if you're approached now to lease your minerals, we have the opportunity to include language that can be more favorable to us to ensure that if a company down the road decides to use natural gas from any wells that we are receiving royalties on, that we're getting paid our fair share for the use of that gas, whether it's for on-site cloud computing for AI, which is becoming a huge growth area, or for Bitcoin mining, or for even just generating electricity to push back into the grid. So there's all sorts of applications for using natural gas for generating electricity. So Justin, this is something that seems to be gaining steam in a lot of areas.
Absolutely, Matt. And to an oil and gas lease, they've used natural gas for a long time to power things on site. But it's really different when you're talking about taking that stranded natural gas or natural gas that's being produced and using that to generate a product that is generating income. And again, like you mentioned, Matt, there's things that we need to put into our lease. Otherwise, those lines really just aren't very clear with the way that language was 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, most likely.
Yeah, that's exactly right. These old historical leases, they had not even thought of this as a potential use case for natural gas. It was either, they're going to build a pipeline and it would be sold, or it would have to be flared and nobody would get the value for it. Nowadays, that is changing, like Justin mentioned. And when it comes to negotiating an oil and gas lease, just to take a step back, if you're a brand new mineral owner or just kind of learning about all of this, when you have mineral rights, you have the right to grant to a third party a lease to explore, drill, and produce any oil and gas that's on your mineral interest. Now, technically, you could go and do that yourself, but in practical terms, it's very expensive and a very technical operation to go and drill a well. So, what we do is we sort of outsource that to somebody that's their business, right? That's an oil and gas company, that's an operator that does that on a daily basis. And so, the way that we facilitate that is through that oil and gas lease. Now, normally what happens is the mineral rights owner is paid a royalty based on the value of the oil and gas that's produced. So you get paid your proportional share of the royalty on that production. And ideal situation, you have a pipeline hooked up and you have pipelines that are hooked up to the well site that can transport any natural gas liquids, as well as oil, and all of that's sold to market. And then this all becomes sort of a moot point. But there are certain situations in certain basins where you're in an area that they're really going after the oil, and that's really the economic driver for them to drill the well. And at the same time, there's a lot of natural gas that's there, but then sometimes there's not the infrastructure yet to handle that natural gas. And so the options are that either the operator has to wait until that infrastructure gets put into place before they can start to produce those wells, or they go in and they truck off the oil, or they have a pipeline maybe that's nearby for oil, and then they have to flare the natural gas. But like we mentioned earlier, states are not allowing that as a routine practice anymore. And so operators are going to have to get creative in order to be able to produce the oil and do something with the gas and capture the value there. And so the thing that they've been turning to are companies that will come in and, as a service, they will sign a gas purchase agreement and buy their natural gas for some price, and then they'll use that gas on the well site with a natural gas generator to generate electricity for these mobile data centers. So if you can picture what I'm talking about, it's basically a shipping container that has rows of specialized computers in there with fans and other electrical equipment to basically to use that generated electricity for some purpose. And so what we want to do as a mineral owner is, if that ends up happening on your wells, that you have the language in your oil and gas lease that you're going to get paid fair amount for that natural gas that's used on site.
You nailed it, Matt. And, there's different aspects to that lease. You've got the royalty clause, which is just what Matt was talking about. That's ensuring that you have that specific language that you're sure that it includes, being compensated for activities like Bitcoin mining, computing, energy generation, whatever it is. There's production allowances, Matt, which is probably the part that has been around the longest. And that's, using that natural gas for production related activities, drilling, hydraulic fracturing. But it's important to set limits on the amount of oil or gas that can be used for these activities. And, now that we're talking about an application outside of just using this for things like that, it becomes even more important to really limit that and ensure that they're just using it for whatever's related to producing that oil and gas. And then surface use agreements also come into play. If that oil and gas lease requires a lessee to build a well or other infrastructure, that surface use agreement has to be in place. And Matt, it's just a new way and a new opportunity to make money. But again, the language that we're signing with leases are not very clear. And as you mentioned earlier, we have the opportunity to kind of cash in on this by being sure if we do sign a lease that we include this language going forward. And Matt, we talk about in episode 6 how to negotiate an oil and gas lease. And I would say all of that still applies. However, as we mentioned in that episode, things are constantly changing. It's really great to work with an attorney that knows the latest verbiage that they should be using and what they should be including.
No, that's a great point. I think that's the key takeaway here is none of this should replace hiring an attorney that's qualified to negotiate and to come up with the specific language, because it really is going to be important to word this stuff very in a specific way in your state, just again, based on the case law. And this is an area that's definitely developing. So it's changing, very rapidly. But, we'll talk in general terms about some of the things to think about is there's a couple of things. So having worked in the industry, I will say that it is important that the operator is allowed to flare if they need to. And usually this should be on a temporary basis, whether that is when a well is completed, immediately after completing and they're flowing back, or maybe there's an upset condition, like an emergency situation, they need to be able to flare for safety reasons. So that is okay. Now, what we're talking about is the continuous use of gas instead of, paying a royalty for gas that's sold. And so I think there's certain things you can do is you could put language in your lease that limits the lessee's ability to flare gas and not pay a royalty to a certain number of days cumulatively. So again, that should be a very rare situation. And if you have some language that limits it to say 30 days cumulatively, they can use it for free if they need to flare. But then after that, they need to pay market value such on that flared gas as if it had been sold. And so that kind of language is what we're talking about, that if you have the protection in there, that if they do go into a situation where they're now routinely using that gas, that you are going to get paid as if that gas had been sold. And so I think that is important to include that kind of language. Some of the things that are included in oil and gas lease, and I just was looking at a recent lease that I had. So one lease says that if a lessee uses oil and gas substances other than as fuel for production and sale of the oil and gas, in lieu of receiving the sale proceeds, the price that they should use shall be based on a weighted average sales price in an arm's length sale to unaffiliated parties for that month. So that is another option. So if you have to use this, you're selling it to some third party. It's not actually being sold on the market. There are other gas that's sold in the area. At least give me that market price. The thing to keep in mind is that certain areas like Waha Hub in West Texas, natural gas can sell at a significant discount. So even though you get paid a royalty, you need to keep in mind that the way that you word it here will determine what you get paid. So it's very important to talk about how that price is determined, because it could be that Waha Hub price of gas is like $1 per MCF, in which case that's not a lot of value that you're getting for that gas. Whereas if maybe you had negotiated some other reference point, you could be paid a little bit more. The other thing you got to think about too, on the flip side of that, so I'll say this is on one thing, consider to the extent that you have the power to negotiate these types of clauses to protect and to make sure you get paid for natural gas use, again, for things like generating power or electricity on the well site. The other side of it is if they can't do something with the gas, if your lease is overly restrictive and it's not economic for them to go ahead and produce, then you could be shooting yourself in the foot, because for these wells, the oil is where the most of the value is, and you would still get paid the oil royalties. And so you have to think about, okay, are they going to be able to actually produce this well if I have an overly restrictive language in my lease that doesn't allow them to use the natural gas to generate electricity or something like that? So there's a trade-off here, I think, Justin, to think about.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I think it's easy as a mineral right owner to think, okay, well, I want this to be just absolutely as restrictive as I can get it. And though that's the case, you have to be open to the other side of the table saying, hey, this just isn't economic, or being sure that you're kind of looking at other leases in the area. And we talk about that in our leasing episode, Matt, that, if you have neighbors, if you have family, a lot of times it's great to talk to them and see, what the operators are offering or what discussions they've had. And Matt, the use that we kind of stumbled upon here that I think is new, we talked about again, we talked about this applying to Bitcoin mining, but now it's really growing for cloud computing as well. And there were some claims by this company, Crusoe Cloud. They're saying that it reduces CO2 equivalent emissions by 6 times compared to wind and hydropower. And that's some big claims, Matt. But it's a great way for companies to be able to really generate and process high loads of data through a data center, through Bitcoin mining, whatever it is, that huge intake of energy that's required for those servers to process the data. And they're doing it with something that would otherwise be flared. So it's a great technology.
Yeah, I think it's really innovative. It's solving two problems. The first problem is that we have natural gas that does not have a market. And so we're bringing the market to the natural gas to a certain extent. And then the second part is companies are really looking at how do they reduce their methane emissions, because flaring is not as efficient in destroying the methane that's emitted. The best way you can actually get rid of it is by using it. And so what they do is they burn it to like 99 plus percent of the methane when they run it through a natural gas generator. So that actually reduces the carbon equivalent emissions. So when methane goes into the atmosphere, it's got a very high CO2 equivalent. It's very much a high warming potential as compared to even CO2. So it's even more of an impact on warming potentially. And so what we want to do is reduce the amount of methane emissions. And one of the ways to do that is by using it to generate electricity versus flaring. So we can reduce it by several percentage points just by doing that. And that has a big impact. And that's where I think this Crusoe Energy, which is one of the larger companies that's doing this distributed cloud computing and Bitcoin mining at natural gas and oil well sites across the United States. And the way they sort of claim these emissions reductions is because they're actually reducing the amount of methane that's getting emitted. And so that has a big impact. In fact, there's some interesting statistics here that for cloud computing for AI, each Crusoe Cloud GPU, which is a graphics processing unit, which is basically the hardware that they use to run these large language models and these AI models, basically one of those devices, actually it's the equivalent of removing one gasoline powered car for a year off the road. So that's a pretty significant amount of carbon equivalent emissions that's being eliminated by using this natural gas this way. And I think, Justin, when we think about the market here, OpenAI, which is a company that most people may have heard of, they're the developers of ChatGPT. And there was an interesting chart on their website, which we'll link to in the show notes, that shows the total amount of compute from 2012 to 2018 has increased 300,000 times. This is for basically these large language models, machine learning, AI. And so that is basically, if you think about this trajectory that we're on, it's rapidly increasing. And so we're using more and more electricity for AI compute applications, whether it's ChatGPT, Google Bard, Microsoft Bing, all these companies have some sort of AI model that they're rolling out. And all this takes a tremendous amount of electricity to run these computers. And so companies are looking at how do they do this, use the lowest cost form of energy. And stranded natural gas is one of the lowest cost ways to get electricity for these types of data centers.
You said it, man. And, with the excitement around AI, a lot of it focuses around the huge amounts of data sets that it can process through. It can make predictions and all of those things that has been something that's held us back with technology currently. But with that comes also a huge explosion in the usage of the energy. And this is something that, Matt, we have an article here that we're kind of looking through. And there's new concern coming up that what impact the energy footprint is going to leave for processing all of this information. And I don't know, Matt, that we're far enough into it yet that they really know, this is the exact consumption for everything that they're trying, but we know that there's going to be exponential growth. And using that stranded gas is one of the options that it just seems to make a lot of sense. And Matt, the Department of Energy estimates that data centers account for about 2% of the total U.S. energy usage. Worldwide data centers consume more than some countries. And we're forecasted for significant growth over the next decade, with some predicting by 2030, computing and communications will consume between 8 and 20% of the world's electricity, with data centers accounting for a third of that. And Matt, that's just exponential growth, and it's huge.
Yeah, and I think that just shows the potential of this. I think it's been sort of a niche thing up until this point. You know, you hear of maybe relatively few mineral and royalty owners that are having to deal with this situation. I think it's going to become more and more widespread as, you know, we have this situation where there is expensive electricity if you're hooked up to the grid. And, you know, from a reliability standpoint, natural gas is kind of always on. And it looks like companies like Crusoe have figured out how to marry the use of natural gas for on-site power generation with high reliability and high uptime, which these data centers traditionally have required. And so if you can do that, then it opens up these locations that have high price differentials for natural gas. In other words, natural gas is selling for significantly below Henry Hub prices. And it's because, again, there's an oversupply or a glut of natural gas in a particular area. Well, you can actually bring in these data centers and use some of this natural gas at a low price point to meet some of the computing needs. And this can be moved around. And so as those price differentials ebb and flow, so maybe it goes back up and it's not as economic, they can go to another area that has too much natural gas and then go hook up there. And that's the beauty of these mobile data centers, is they can be moved very easily. So I think it is something that more and more mineral and royalty owners will hear about and will be faced with. And so I think, again, the moral of the story for this episode is when you structure your oil and gas lease, ask this question to your attorney. You know, what language should I include in order to protect myself if a company decides that they want to use the natural gas for an extended period of time instead of selling it to the market? And just make sure that, you know, you're getting paid something for that natural gas. Now, it could be, again, whether it's the arm's length transaction, whatever the natural gas is selling for in other well sites near your minerals, or if it is something where there's a fixed price or there's a limited time that they can use it for flaring. You know, I think to a certain extent, incentivizing them to sell the gas, again, even if it is for on site use, at the end of the day, as long as they're selling it and using it for some beneficial application, then it really doesn't matter from a mineral and royalty owner perspective. We get paid our royalty. They get to use the natural gas and they get to produce the oil, which you benefit from as well. So it's kind of a win-win situation. Again, as long as you're getting paid something for the gas that's being used, you don't want to be in a situation where you give them free reign to use the natural gas without paying you. I think there needs to be some calculation of payment there. And again, that could be a negotiation. If there is no market in that area, it's all being used for natural gas power generation, then it becomes more difficult to sort of monitor what you should have gotten paid. But again, to the extent you're negotiating a new lease, you know, putting language in there to protect yourself will help.
Absolutely, Matt. And if we know one thing is sure in this world, there will be case law to come. If this becomes something that gets larger and becomes a regular operating procedure, we're sure to see court cases that will settle exactly how this is to be handled, and, you know, that we'll see to regulate it as well.
Yeah. And it'd be interesting, Justin, if you think about oil and gas leases as the case law develops and as this gets figured out, but there's always been, you know, certain older leases, and then even in some more sophisticated leases, the right to take any natural gas in kind. And it'd be interesting if you have that clause in your lease and you have a significant amount of net MCF of gas that you could use in kind. You know, how could you go into a situation and use that for some of these applications? That's pretty getting to the more sophisticated side of things, but you know, that it would be an interesting discussion if you have that language in your lease, which technically you would be able to entertain that thought.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. That would be very interesting. And, you know, it'll be interesting to see how the court decides to interpret that. I think that there's a case to make on either side. It may come down to which attorney can better explain it and what precedence there is.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think at the end of the day, you know, think the big picture, right? So it's a lot of times as mineral and royalty owners, we get bogged down in the details. Okay, so ideal situation we've talked about, again, you negotiate language that allows you to get a fair royalty for the use of the natural gas, whether they use it forever to mine Bitcoin or whatever, that's fine. At the end of the day, it's benefiting the environment. It's benefiting you because you're getting a royalty for production of oil that would have not otherwise been produced, because if the operator can't flare and they can't use the natural gas on site, it's too cost prohibitive to install the infrastructure. Frankly, they're just going to shut in the well. And so you have to think about the bigger picture, that if you don't allow operators to do this and put in guardrails and put in protections that you get paid your fair share, then they're just going to go and do it somewhere else because it's not going to be economic. They're not in the business of producing oil and just giving it away, right? They have to be able to make a profit or break even at least. And so that is something to consider, is that you're getting paid usually a significant amount of money on the oil royalty that might not otherwise happen if they're not able to use the gas. So I think that's important to think about and understand the bigger picture of these areas and what are the infrastructure constraints that you have in your area, and having a conversation with the operator. Usually they're willing to work with you, and they're going to try to do what's best for everybody in the long term, to the extent they continue to make money and they can continue to meet the environmental regulations that are getting even more and more strict each year. And so I think these are going to be the types of situations that we're going to be faced with more and more as flaring is getting taken off the table.
You said it, Matt. And to answer your point on that, it may not be something that you're hearing about on your property currently, but these leases can last for many, many, many years to come. And it's worth, having that conversation with your attorney and including that, even if, currently the prospect isn't just right knocking on your door.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think big picture, I think long term. And then I think the moral of the story again is to get help from a qualified attorney. There's definitely folks, if you attend any of the National Association of Royalty Owner events, we have had a couple of presentations on this topic, and we'll continue to keep our members educated on how this is developing. But, again, hooking up with an attorney that is familiar with these types of situations, familiar with the type of language that should be used in your state to ensure that you get paid a fair royalty on the use of natural gas, and or putting in place limits for how long or for what applications they can use the gas. Because, again, it's been pretty common that they've used natural gas on site for heater treaters and things like that, all the oil processing equipment, the surface equipment that needs to keep running in order to produce the oil and gas safely. So, it's usually a pretty small amount of gas, which is why it hasn't really been an issue before, because it's been pretty minimal. I'm talking, single digits or tens of MCF, or maybe a couple hundred MCF per month at most. But mostly it's been very small amount of gas that's used. Now we're talking about the need to potentially use thousands and thousands of MCF per month. And so that's why this is becoming a point of discussion.
No, absolutely, man. It makes a lot of sense that this is coming up, and with the growth in computing power that's planned, it'll be interesting to see where this road leads.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where it leads, and we'll continue to keep you updated. So stay tuned for future episodes as we learn more about the use of natural gas or stranded natural gas for AI computing or for Bitcoin mining. Definitely an interesting application, and I bet when folks were drilling wells 40, 50 years ago, this was never something that entered into their mind. And so it's really cool to see the technology develop to where the oil and gas industry can solve both an environmental problem as well as a technical problem. And again, as mineral and royalty owners, we stand to benefit from that as long as we take a couple of steps just to make sure we protect our interests.
You said it, Matt.
All right. Well, that wraps it up for this episode. Thanks again for listening. Again, we'll link to the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com, where you can find the resources we mentioned in this episode. Thanks again, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.